Thank you for coming. My name is Russell Hittinger. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Human Ecology. And before I go any further, I want to recognize and thank our co-sponsors, the Project on Constitutional Originalism and the Catholic Intellectual Tradition, that's Joel Alicia, and the Center for Law and the Human Person, led by Elizabeth Kirk. They are co-sponsors and supporters of the event. Tonight's panel promises to provide a very stimulating conversation on a beloved saint, Sir Thomas More, who is renowned for modeling civic behavior and integrity in acting according to the dictates of faith and conscience. And I'm pleased to introduce our two capable panelists who will guide us for the next hour and 15 minutes or so. First, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. William Fahey, to my left, a fellow at Thomas More College of Liberal Arts in New Hampshire, where he also serves as the third president of the college. He holds a BA in History and Honors AB in Classics from Xavier University, an MPhil in Ancient History from the University of St. Andrews, and a Master's in Science and Wildlife Conservation as well. There you are, sorry. And an MA and a PhD in Early Christian Studies from the Catholic University of America. And to my left, Dr. Meehan is the Associate Dean for the Hillsdale College's Washington, D.C. campus, and Assistant Professor of Government for the Van Andel Graduate School of Government. For the last 5 years, he has also taught for the college's Washington Hillsdale Internship Program for undergraduates. He has been teaching and designing humanities curricula for 20 years. Dr. Meehan is a graduate of the University of Dallas and the valedictorian of his class. And staying at Dallas, he received BA in Politics, MA in English, and PhD in Literature. Before we begin, just a brief set of remarks about how we're going to proceed. We will begin with Dr. Fahey, who will speak for perhaps 30 minutes, and then Dr. Meehan can respond 15 or 20 minutes, and then I will moderate a conversation between the two, and at some point you'll have a chance to ask questions. Okay, let's get started.
All right, good evening. If I speak in that tone, can everyone hear? A little bit louder? Yep, I can speak louder. I just don't want to echo. So thank you for that introduction, Dr. Hittinger, and thank you to the many people who helped organize this talk. This is the second attempt to bring me back to Catholic U to give this talk. I can't remember what happened with the first time. I think someone in my family was ill, but it's a real delight to be here. It's been 30 years, almost exactly, since I was in this building. And the last time I was in this building, it was to get an omelet. This was a dining hall when I was a student here. And those of you who are graduate students, if you think anything is dysfunctional, underfunded, sloppy looking, messy, doesn't work, it looks great. Things are moving in the right direction. I'm very impressed. It's very nice to come back for a visit to CUA. I, as you could probably tell from that introduction, am not a More specialist. I want to be very clear on that. I'm not a specialist in Thomas More. My background is in history, specifically early medieval history. I teach at what most people would call a Great Books College, which means I rove all over the curriculum, and I like it that way. But I teach at Thomas More College, and it would be impious if I didn't spend time learning about Thomas More. And as the president of the college, I've sort of muscled people as much as possible to join me in studying Thomas More. So for the last 16 years at Thomas More College, we have something called Traditio Days. And I see there are a number of Thomas More graduates here who know what Traditio Day is. Traditio Day is we spend the whole day, faculty and students together, reading a work of Thomas More. We usually do this 2 to 4 times a year. The faculty as well have an ongoing reading group where we use the essential works of Thomas More that Dr. Meehan helped put together, and we're working through all of his works. So I'm an amateur in the best sense, but I am not a specialist, and I don't want anyone to have any illusions about that. Part of the collateral damage of not being a specialist, being a generalist, is the nature of this talk. This talk is the fruit of Stephen Higgins calling me one night when I thought I was done for the day and I'm drinking a bourbon, and I got a text message from Stephen Higgins saying, "What would you say to someone who said, More really shouldn't have been canonized? Fisher's the man. What did More do? He was silent. Fisher did all these things to try to stop the disaster." And I fired back what I would say to such a person, and some of it is the genesis of this talk. Because I teach at a Great Books College and I also serve as president, it means that I don't usually give talks more than once. So I prepared this talk for this event, and I also prepared it in the last 48 hours. As a result, it's far more material than I can cover tonight, and because I only finished it this morning, the gentlemen who are on the panel with me did not have the traditional right, which is to have a look at what you're about to say so that they can respond with intelligence and grace. So any errors, fumbling, irritation, that's entirely my fault. Now, this question I originally thought was an odd question. Who would pit Fisher and More and have a negative comparison? And then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, More's daughter Meg herself was puzzled at her father's behavior and her father's silence publicly. And then when I started doing a little bit of research in the canonization of More, I realized that in 1935, quite a number of people were astonished that Thomas More was being elevated to the status of saint. Fisher they understood, but there were protests against More's canonization in England. Now, most of the protests came from the people that you would expect. The established church protested. Oxford and Cambridge refused to send delegates to any of the events. Parliament issued a letter of disappointment. I'm not sure what that looked like. But there was a general frown in England at the time of More's canonization. And the view can be summarized by an article in the London Observer by Ernest Baker, who was a very prominent political philosopher at that time. Baker wrote, "More, in the final trials of his faith, was obstinately silent about his real thoughts. There's something negative in this attitude. More died for the right of free conscience, provided it were silent. But is free conscience which keeps silent really free?" Now, I give that more to you just to get at the tone, that there are intelligent people who have always said, why exactly does More deserve canonization? Why is he a great man on the issue that led to his death, since he was so silent on that matter? Now, my response, what I'm going to do is I'm going to fly at 30,000 feet, and I'm going to give you all of my reasons why I think More's silence should be revered and why it is that he deserves canonization. And then I'm going to zoom in just on 2 or 3 of them for the bulk of my time. We'll go in detail on that. But first, an overview of all of them. Maybe this will be fodder for questions, conversations. Maybe those of you who are graduate students, this will allow you to write an interesting paper. Again, I'm not a More scholar, and so if someone has already done the paper, I apologize. But this is all novel to me and interesting. The first thing that I will come back to is simply the opening question. Why didn't More respond publicly? Why didn't he say more? Why didn't he speak out? In some respects, this strikes me as a very modern thing to say. It's very common in our culture to place great value on speaking, commenting, and publicly criticizing. That wasn't More, as we'll see. He was much more circumspect, even in his youngest days, even with polemical writings. The second reason I think More was silent in the way that More was has to do with his great fear of civil war, a real fear that the realm was still very unstable. And he had prudential reasons for being very cautious about speaking about the king's great matter and the issues that led to his death. Third, the matter was complicated. The king's great matter was extremely complicated. I think now we have a better appreciation for this. 15 years ago, if someone had said to me, papal primacy is a complicated matter, I would have been on the side of, no, it's not. It's pretty straightforward. Questions of annulment and the church's role in granting dispensations is a complicated matter. More consistently said throughout his life, I would prefer not to meddle in such matters. So More was silent in response to the complexity of the issue at hand. More specifically on the papacy, spent most of his life being a critic of the papacy, not the wonderful Paul Scofield defender of the papacy, the French existentialist Thomas More that dies for the papacy in a totally incoherent play and movie that we all love, but which is not Thomas More. More actually was highly critical of the papacy up till close to the end. And he was sort of pushed into defending the papacy by some of his close friends. Fifth, More was an excellent lawyer. He was the finest lawyer in England. And in the face of a dangerous matter, a dangerous legal matter, one would expect that a lawyer is cautious in the use of his words. Then I have a host of reasons that relate to King Henry. Sixth, More actually thought for most of his life that it would be possible to balance his fidelity to the crown and the church. And I think he went to his death trying to illustrate it was possible. Seventh, More was silent because he loved Henry VIII. Catholics are taught all about the bloated, syphilitic, awful Henry VIII. Thomas More, I think, loved Henry VIII. I think he had absolute charity for him and was saddened by the turn of events, but he had an abiding love for him. Eighth, More didn't need to say anything because the man who needed to hear More's position already knew it. Thomas More had already revealed directly to Henry VIII his reasons for not signing the oath, not speaking out on the matter of the divorce. The one man that he wanted to know knew, so there was no need to say anything. Ninth, More, though he would become a canonized saint and is an eminent and holy person, More was a man of flesh and blood, and he knew what happened if you were accused and found guilty of treason. You would be hung. That means hung until you started to pass out. Then they would lower you down. Then he would be disemboweled and have parts of his body cut off while he was still alive, boiled in front of him. And then he would be drawn and quartered. The church does not require that anyone desire such an end. More wanted to avoid such an end. More also wanted to avoid any case that would force bankruptcy and impoverish his family. So that was another good prudential reason for being silent. And finally, my 10th reason is More was a thespian. More was a dramatist. More was a poet. And so he knew how to use everything as a kind of instrument to heighten drama in order to communicate a truth. All right, now I only want to look at 2 or 3 of these. I have a clock, but I've forgotten already what time I am supposed to end, and that will help me gauge. 15 minutes? All right. So the first thing, commentary itself. we're used to calm war, flame outs. We think it's virtuous and wonderful and exciting for intellectuals and non-intellectuals to hurl mud at one another, or at least say exactly what's on their mind at all time. I would recommend that you look at a 40-page letter that More wrote when he was young to a theologian named Martin Dorp. This shows us More precisely at the moment when he's becoming very aware of how great an intellect he has. He's positioning himself for publishing a great life. He's young. It's exactly the moment when you would love to have a sparring match with someone publicly. In that letter to Dorp, More makes 2 points that I want to share with you about speaking to another person about their errors. The first is, one should be careful about this because it's easy to twist words. He tells Dorp, who's just attacked Erasmus, he should have been more circumspect. So Dorp jumped in the commentary box on an article Erasmus published and torched him. More jumps in the commentary box and he shows great charity, saying things like, I say all these things merely to prove, this is after he talks about a preface that Dorp wrote to a book that More likes. He thinks it's nicely written, but it had problems and it had errors in it. And after pointing out some of the errors on minor things, More says, I say all these things merely to prove that not even sheer trifles are immune to misrepresentation, since your own meticulous and carefully polished writings require that we read them indulgently. To read intelligent work requires a kind of indulgence and generosity on the part of the reader. It's easy to make errors in works. More importantly, More feared his own comments might cause offense. So at the end of that letter, he says to the man he is very, I won't say gently, he's criticizing charitably. He's using intellectual charity and criticizing Dorp. He says to him, still, I hope even as such it is, you will not find my letter displeasing. For although I rely first of all on your humane indulgence, I also rely on the thoroughness of my own effort to guard against writing one word in this letter that might give you just cause for offense, unless through human weakness, esteem for my own works misleads me. If it does ever happen, and I am advised of it, I will freely acknowledge my fault and not try to defend it. Indeed, just as I am not slow to advise those I love, should it be in their interest, so too, on my honor, I am delighted to have friends advise me. More was, as a young man, already very cautious about the use of words. The other thing regarding the use of words that I want to make sure is put out there, because I've never really seen it studied, and I believe it's important for understanding More, is his love of the Carthusians and the monastic life. Now, most people who study More know he lived in the charter house. He liked the Carthusians. He had this struggle. Should I be a monk? Should I be a layman? But they never really talk about the Carthusians. The standard biographies don't unpack this. I want to read to you parts of the opening of the rule of the Carthusians. And when More lived with the Carthusians as a law student, he placed himself under this rule, and he would have studied this rule carefully. As you know, in the Old Testament, and still more so in the New, says the introduction, written by Guigo II, almost all of God's secrets of major importance and hidden meaning were revealed to his servants, not in the turbulence of the crowd, but in the silence of solitude. And you know, too, that these same servants of God, when they wish to penetrate more profoundly some spiritual truth, or pray with greater freedom, or become a stranger to things earthly in the ardent elevation of the soul, nearly always fled the hindrance of the multitude for the benefits of silence and solitude. The prophet Jeremiah also said, it is good for a man to await the salvation of God in silence. The solitary will sit and keep silence, for he will lift himself above himself. Here the prophet makes reference to nearly all that is best in our life: peace, solitude, silence, and the thirst for heaven. When More was at the Charterhouse, he read an incredible amount of spiritual writings, especially in the English tradition. And one of the works he liked most was The Mixed Life by Walter Hilton, which explained that a man could, not merely a secular priest, but a layman could bring together the contemplative life and the active life and keep those in balance if he had the virtue of silence and solitude. So More, when he makes that critical decision to become Thomas More and not become a priest but be a lawyer and a statesman, makes that decision with a view that the life that he wants to live, active and contemplative, can be bound together so long as he preserves great restraint over his tongue. Now, More was incredibly concerned about civil war. It wasn't that long ago, just shortly before More's birth, that the civil wars, the War of the Roses, had ended. And More grew up in the household of Archbishop, later Cardinal Morton, who had helped orchestrate the end of the wars and the advancement of the Tudor family and the creation of stability in England. So I am sure that More was saturated in the thought of Cardinal Morton. One of the first and earliest works of Thomas More was his History of Richard III. C.S. Lewis considers this to be the first modern biography, and it's fascinating for what it has to say about politics. Throughout, the work tells us a couple key things, and one of the key messages, this is written sometime between 1510 and 1520. So More's still young, around the time of Utopia. And one of the key messages of that text is a warning: so much mischief is grown when marriages be not well made. More never published this work. As he was finishing, the King's Great Matter was emerging. And so there are obvious reasons why you might not publish a work that focused on the instability caused by the lack of an heir, bad marriages, demeaning women, persecuting the church. These are all hot issues. Towards the end of the work, which doesn't go all the way to the death of Richard III, there's a conversation between More's patron, Archbishop Morton, and the Duke of Gloucester about the nature of politics. And the Duke asks the Archbishop, "Why aren't you speaking out about Richard? We know all the signs of a tyrant. Why don't you speak out?" And Morton says, "In good faith, my lord, I love not much to talk much of princes, as think not all out of peril, though the word be without fault, forasmuch as it shall not be taken as party meant, but as pleaseth the prince to construe it. I.e., I'll support a regime, but I'm not going to say much about it, because kings have a tendency to take words and get them to say what they need them to say." And then Morton instead tells an Aesop's fable about the behavior of the lion doing what he wants through the laws. And then Morton concludes, speaking of Richard III, the tyrant, "Since he is now king in possession, I purpose not to dispute titles." I think all this is a great foreshadowing and a model of how More will navigate Tudor politics. He will do so with great caution. Now let me speak last, at least in detail last, about More the thespian. And you can see I'm skipping all the fun things I was reading and thinking the last couple of days. In 1528, when More was chancellor of the realm, the highest office of the land, a terribly busy man, More was chosen to be the master of revels. Now, the master of revels got a bad name under Elizabethan times because it tended to be occupied by those of a Calvinist bent that hated drama. But in the Middle Ages and in the Tudor period, the master of revels was a person who loved drama, understood drama, helped in the financing, the vetting of actors, the organization of plays. And More was chosen to be part of this office of the Masters of Revels. He was the number 2. He was kind of the assistant or associate master of revels. If you look carefully at his life, More had always supported miracle plays. He was fascinated in plays. When he was a boy in Cardinal Morton's court as a page, he impressed people because as he was watching plays, he would occasionally, not having read the script and not being a player, he would step into the play and create a part right there and act out within the play so well that people were distracted and thought this was the best character in the play. And Morton, from this, concludes this man will have a marvelous future and ends up being the patron to send him to Oxford and so forth. In that great text, Richard III, there's some fascinating things said about drama that More says just in observation about the people. More says, men must sometimes, for the manner's sake, not be a knowing what they know. And in a stage play, all people know right well that he that playeth the Sultan is perhaps the cobbler. So sometimes we know, and we know this when we experience theater, that you have to not know what you in fact know, both the player and the audience, people watching. They have to go through this drama. Sometimes the king is played by a cobbler. Sometimes the sultan is played by a cobbler. More continues and says the audience are also players, and that they must never ruin a play by shouting out the truth about the players. And that the same thing for plays, as he says, holds true for the king's game, politics. Both are, as it were, stage plays. Both, for the more, played out on scaffolds. That's an interesting and prophetic remark. In which poor men be but onlookers, and they that wise be will meddle no farther. For they that sometimes step up and play with them, when they cannot play their part well, they bring disorder to the play and do themselves no good. That word meddle is interesting because it shows up again and again and again when More is being interrogated, and they ask him to comment on papal primacy or the validity of the marriage. And he says, I have no interest in meddling with such things. I never have. Now to move to some concluding remarks, at least for now. More, well, maybe we'll come back to poetry. I have a lot more to say about poetry. More, I think, exemplifies perfectly question 124 of the second part, where St. Thomas sets forth what is the essence of martyrdom. Martyrdom consists essentially in standing firmly on behalf of the truth and justice against the assaults of persecutors. In martyrdom, a man is firmly strengthened in the good of a virtue, especially fortitude, since the martyr cleaves to faith and justice, notwithstanding the threatening danger of death, the imminence of which is due to a kind of contest with the persecutors. The perfection of martyrdom lies not in the endurance to death, so it's not so much that you endure it, it's not some physical tough thing, first and foremost, but the decision of the martyr to die for virtue, most especially the twin virtue of charity for God and neighbor. Fourth, The deed that seals this perfection of martyrdom is the renunciation of life, not any testimony or any particular act, any other particular act. And then finally he adds, almost as if to clarify that fourth point, Thomas says that a profession of the faith, which is intrinsic to martyrdom, is a profession to any truth derived from God, whether that profession is made with word or deed. Now, if you know the famous ending of the trial when More breaks his silence, "For as much, my lord, as this is an indictment grounded upon an act of parliament directly repugnant to the laws of God." This is the most famous, well-known speech that More makes, where he's about to be condemned, and then he actually breaks his silence, and then he just puts it all out there on what he thinks. If you think of that for a moment, and think in particular how that speech, which ends with almost a riot in Parliament, how that speech ends, and then think back about what Thomas has said about the most perfect martyr, I think you see that More fulfills it both in deed and in word, but in Thomas's central point about the perfection of martyrdom lies not in the endurance to death, but the decision to die for virtue, most especially for the twin virtue of charity. Most especially for the twin virtue of charity. More ends his speech, as he did so many letters to his enemies as well as his family, with something similar. He ends his speech, "More have I not to say, my lords, but that like as the blessed apostle St. Paul, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles, was present and consented to the death of St. Stephen, and kept their clothes that stoned him to death, and yet be they now twain holy saints in heaven, and shall continue there, friends forever. So I verily trust, and therefore right heartily pray, that though your lordships have now in earth been judges to my condemnation, we may yet hereafter in heaven merrily all meet together to our everlasting salvation." In other words, he essentially forgives them on the spot and says, my prayer is that you die well and that we're united. This is perfect martyrdom, which testifies to the truth of God, chiefly in standing firm for his truth and justice in the face of years of mounting persecution. It is perfect martyrdom that ends in Thomas More's giving up his body for the sake of Christ, his holy church, as well as the law. It illustrates deeds and words joined perfectly in the end, with a clear expression of both love of God and love of neighbor, and expressly neighbors who stood as persecutors. This speech, this final speech, the fruit of Thomas More's long silence, is only surpassed by his comment on the scaffold, which itself is a perfect summary of the law and of More's cause. I die, the king's good servant, and God's first. I think that is a perfect summary of the law. Absolute love of neighbor and God. And he expresses that in his final words. And so More's silence is fruitful. It's particular to the man. I think it can be defended, and it flowers in some final words that clarify for anyone like Ernst Baker or the British establishment in 1935 who don't understand, how can you say Thomas More should have been made a saint? Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you. And I know you withheld something that I'll kick off that both of us were thinking about. We actually had the good fortune to drive together over here the hotel. What I'll try to do, this is, as he mentioned, this isn't classical, this is jazz, so I'm going to kind of riff on his talk. But I also feel as though, in the sort of spirit of some stage play, he gave a very profound account of More and emphasized his silence. I'll sort of play the city comedy and be a little more impish and emphasize the strange combination of that silence with this guy who wrote this, all of this, right? The man of many words. And it does seem like it's sort of a confounding combination. I don't think so in the end, nor does Dr. Veidt. But when Shakespeare co-wrote his play, the Book of Sir Thomas More, it's the last discovered of Shakespeare's plays, he actually depicts More, first his rise, and he's brilliant and funny, clever, and stages many, many dramas for other people to witness and see. And then his fall, his sort of showdown with Henry, where he goes quiet and says, my conscience must parley with our laws. And then he says nothing more. He gets very quiet about the affair of the king, the great matter. But basically we see him dealing with the persecution of his family, the dispossession of his house and his servants, all the way down to prison, and the slow constriction all the way down to the scaffold, where he's depicted. And in one sense, you see there's sort of a city comedy half of the play, and this sort of scenic and tragedy, the fall of a great man, right, as you'd kind of expect, the wheel of fortune. Although throughout the play, Shakespeare keeps jamming signals. There are strange, tragic moments in the middle of funny city comedy, and there are bizarre comedic moments in the scenic and tragedy of More's fall and death. In one sense, to the Christian, particularly to the Catholic who understands what's at stake in his martyrdom, of course there's going to be a sort of divine comedy, and so there is. He ends on the scaffold in the play just as he ended in his own life. And I've just gotten to know Dr. Veidt, but we're kindred spirits because he nailed the last words, and that's sort of the test in my mind. I die the king's good servant and God's first. I can't tell you how many people I've heard say but there's actually no record of that. That is to say, the hope of serving both God and man, of a perfectly charitable and united martyrdom that both is a martyrial witness to the truths of God, but also the law, the Magna Carta, the truths of England, and civic life, but then also charity for God, charity for neighbor, even on a theological plane. That's instantiated in his last public and official words. That's when he sort of addresses the crowd, and we have it directly from the French who took it down. It's et. It's not but, it's and that's important. But then the local report is that he was cracking jokes up the scaffold, bizarre, like funny, and some people were very scandalized. I'm like, oh, help me up, but don't worry, I'll shift for myself on the way down. Right? The people, it's almost like Groucho Marx, like Waka Waka kind of thing. Quite strange. And his last words, like the actual last words that were not publicly addressed to the crowds, were, "Oh, please don't cut my beard, for it hath not offended the king." Right? Sort of, I don't want to the hangman, I don't want you to cut my beard. Right? Well, Shakespeare plays on that. He doesn't quite dramatize it that way, but he makes the beard a big deal. The wisdom of a beard, the wise man with a beard, right? And that winds up featuring in the middle of the play, which bonds this strange intermingling of tragedy and comedy in a Senecan fall and tragedy and comedy in a sort of Ciceronian rise. And by the way, Cicero and Seneca are even featured in the play. But in the very middle of the play, for Shakespeare, is the marriage of wit and wisdom. It's a play within a play, much like Hamlet, which was written a year later. It's a play within a play, wherein More, because a character forgot his beard and doesn't have his costume, More leaps on stage and takes the place of good counsel. He plays a role, which I think is Shakespeare's nod to what we just heard a moment ago, that he had this sort of dramatic sense of politics is very much akin to theater in some way, that you actually have to sort of take on a kind of persona. You have to play your part, and you have to play it well. There's private dialogue and there's public dialogue. There's a way of carrying yourself when you hold office, and there's a way of carrying yourself when you do not. There's the mode of how you might talk to a friend over a drink, how you talk to your child as their father, how you talk to your child as their father when they're now 25. There's all these modes, and you actually have to have a kind of nimbleness of mind to play them. But when More enters into, right, high office, when he joins the court and actually becomes bound by oath to the king, right? Now he's locked in, right? Now he's playing on that other scaffold. He's no longer in the private city comedy of London. He's now in the court. These be king's games played upon scaffolds. I mean, you're going to get your head cut off. So there's this strange marriage of wit and wisdom, which Shakespeare, I think, in a very powerful homage, and Shakespeare, his first 4 plays were about Richard III, More's Great History. His last play was All's True, or Henry VIII, about the actual cataclysm of More's conflict with Henry. And then his middle play was Sir Thomas More. And there's actually quite a bit. So beginning, middle, and end, he had More, the last great poet of England, on his mind. So I sort of take that as a kind of frame. And I think in one sense, the marriage of wit and wisdom is a sort of representation of this combination of More as both active and contemplative, which, again, I'm in vociferous agreement on this sort of perfection of More's ability to unite these things in one person. But I also think of More's Utopia, which was mentioned also in the talk. I also think of More's Utopia, where he makes a distinction between Philosophia Scholastica, the sort of high theoretical schoolman's philosophy, and then Philosophia Civilitor, civic philosophy, sort of, we might call it political philosophy, that there's this other kind of practical philosophy. And so More, I think, has both the wisdom to see these distinctions between active and contemplative and scholastic philosophy and practical political philosophy. And he has even the wit to see it in different valences. So from the perspective of a contemplative, right, the distinction between wit and wisdom is, do you see the highest end? Do you see heaven? Do you see the next life? Are you detached from this world so that you can move on from it, right? You can't really be a martyr and not have some of that detachment, right? From the perspective of basically the citizen, just the friend, right? I.e. the person who's active in the city and busy about the duties of family and politics and social life and building institutions, all of that, death and taxes. Then the distinction between active contemplative could be looked at as theoretical and practical. There's sort of an idea, but then bringing that idea into praxis, actually sort of pressing whatever your theory is or your good idea or what you see, and actually instantiating it in act, in the city, in speech, right? So you have these sort of, this unification in More that I think is quite witty. Now, commenting on the Carthusian section, right, which again, vociferous disagreement, although I might, vociferous agreement, but I might flip it in one sense. I think More saw himself, as he says, naturally a giglet, that like his autopilot disposition was to be a chatty Cathy. A giglet is, the only place I've ever seen them now are on the streets of Mexico City, but they're like a wooden set of dentures that little tinkers and craftsmen would make, and if you open them, the wood of one side of the hinge would scrape against the other and go, and so then you could go, sort of like a Halloween toy, but they were very kind of a favorite, sort of on the street, something you could buy and give to the kids on a feast day in London. So he says, I'm a natural giglet. I can't stop laughing. He was called Master Mock when he was in Parliament, and he was wicked funny, and he was actually an international wit, and people would come to see him just for conversation's sake. So I think frankly, he saw that excess in him, and I think that was part of his attraction to the Carthusians was, I need the depth of soul and the discipline of speech because I know enough to know that this is not sort of verbal display, sort of high IQ, like am I a good word cell and do I have a great LSAT score? Like that's not the purpose of life. And so he sought out the Carthusians the way I think any wise young man should, right? You have a good, I don't, I want it, right? So you go and try to be with people to gain virtues through osmosis, training, and friendship. But then how do you, but I think it's right that he has this silence. It characterizes him, right? And he also is this incredibly verbal person. I held this book up a minute ago. This is only half of his writings. This is the essential works. If it were the complete works, you couldn't carry it around. It would literally just give everyone a hernia, right? We have to put all the rest of it online because his polemical works are enormous. He wrote, he spilled the banks of English, to quote another novel. How do you combine these things? How do you reconcile them? I think there's two ways to reconcile them. One is More's friendship. He was a friend to all. Erasmus says in the letter to Van Hutten, which describes More's character, he says he seemed to be born for friendship. And in that beautiful letter to Van Hutten, he compares More to Alexander and Achilles. You're like, that's a weird comparison. Why? Well, they're both conquerors, and they both killed their friends, one through abandonment, one through a drunken rage, right? Well, More conquers himself, and then because he's so disciplined, and he has that Carthusian discipline of both tongue, I think, and heart and the hair shirt, the whole 9 yards, he then, because he can turn himself into this unbelievable hero of service and self-sacrifice, he then conquers everyone else in charity and binds himself to the city of London and by stages to the entire people of England, right? And then Europe, the whole of Christendom, and becomes the bon vivant of Christendom, at least in the North. Right? That's an incredible sort of disciplined man who understands the art of friendship. And part of the art of friendship is clearly discretion. You have to preserve the feelings of everyone else around you. You have to be very careful what you say so as not to slander them, so as not to upset them or berate them. And in fact, if, as I think More was, if you want self-government and you'd actually like the crown to be convinced, and I think he was trying throughout his career to convince Henry to give more liberties to the people, he convinced Henry to have the first free speech in Parliament, right? And I think a lot of his writings were an appeal to Henry that you could raise your children, the subjects, up to be adults, i.e. self-governing. I think he was a proto-republican, and that's another longer story, right? But, right, he understands that the only way you have any kind of self-government, any kind of just society, is trust and friendship among all. So he was very careful and governed his incredible speech. The other way you reconcile it is irony, right? Wit, ironic wit, Greek word for other speak, right? Socratic irony. More was the master of irony. So that's another way in which, yes, he was silent and disciplined his tongue and didn't overvalue just self-justifications and, his and could have the discipline of the careful lawyer who's protecting his family, avoiding civil war, honoring his king, and still appealing to him as a friend in love. All those things with, again, vociferous agreement. But he also knew how to say something in another way without saying it, right? Like bank shot, implicit. In the second scene of Shakespeare's Sir Thomas More, there's this very heavy justice who's in charge and outranks More. Kind of feels like a sort of this fat, powerful person. It feels like a little bit of a Henry VIII or a Cardinal Wolsey, right? Some kind of more tyrannical or corrupt leader above him. More set stages a drama where the guy who is trying to kill a thief, a stealer of gold, tries to kill him. He wants to just execute him. More wants him to show mercy. And the guy says, well, gives a big speech in front of the justices. More adjourns, says, let's go and take a walk. Then he sneaks back in, gets the thief to pickpocket the judge, and then uses the same speech that the judge gave against him. Like, you're responsible for having tempted him with all your money. So no one's responsible, right, for killing him in politics, right? There's a big laugh. You don't have to understand the full thrust of this story. It's too detailed. But the line from the judge says, I see ye, Master More. I see ye well enough. More never gives the lesson. He never says it outright. He says it indirectly. And I think that's how he spoke to the king and to the people with all of his writings, that he pushed hard, but he didn't push all the way because there was much that he was the great master of implicit irony. And so and that's actually the soul of persuasion. The thing you're most persuaded by is the thing that you came to the conclusion on. And More knew how to do this. So when you read him, you have to read him with that restrained tongue and the jiglet, the wit and the wisdom of someone who is both being very careful in his speech and teasing you a little and asking you to think a little bit more. In his coronation ode that he gave to Henry upon his coronation, he likened him to Achilles, dressed as a woman, which is insulting. And everyone was like, wow, that's bold, high risk, high reward. And it was designed to show him, hey, those great heroes that you admire who are the warrior kings, who are brutal and strong and barbaric and imperial and sackers of cities, right? Think of the Van Houten letter from Erasmus, right? They're also not in control and do ridiculous and cowardly things. Maybe you should find for yourself a better model of what is to be a great king than that. Did he say that? If he said that, he'd get his head cut off for treason. But he did not say it. And Henry knew he said it. It's hiding in plain sight, behind the lattice. Like, look at me. I love you. I'm not insulting you, but I am correcting you. That's the kind of friend More was to everyone, even in his death and even in his martyrial witness, right? So coming to an understanding of what More is doing might take a long time, but those are some sort of opening thoughts on that.
I think you can banter back and forth at this point.
This will be good. I vociferously agree with your vociferous endorsement of my comments. Yeah, it's a little bit hard when you have two people in agreement bantering. Let's see. I'm a disagreeable person. Surely there was something I said that was problematic. More loved Henry. I thought I'd laid that out. I thought for sure you'd go after me for that.
No, I agree.
Oh.
I'm sorry, vociferous agreement. I think More, one of the reasons, is a big reason why he doesn't attack Henry and doesn't speak out the way Fisher does is in part the whole time it's ABCC, always be closing to the conscience. He took an oath when he became the Lord Chancellor. One of the titles of the Lord Chancellor is the conscience of the king. He is oath bound to be the Jiminy Cricket, right, of the king, right? That little sort of chirping conscience. Now, he steps down from the role, but More also understands that you're not just oath bound, right? That's once you come up and step as twere up to my country's head, as Shakespeare puts it in the one soliloquy More has in his play. He knows that now you're a princeps, a Ciceronian first citizen. All eyes are on you no matter what you do, right? You can't just sort of retire to the Bahamas. You are now invested with mimetic power. People are going to imitate you. They're going to want to know what you do. They're going to follow your lead, right? You're going to scandalize or you're going to moralize through your example. And More knew that he was friend to the king, right? And that he had been the conscience of the king, and that the only prudent and loving play for Henry was, right, have him try to convert his mind to relent on this point. This gets to, I think, another understudied part of and I'll be quick and we'll find other points of vociferous agreement. This is an understudied part of More, and I think of our tradition, which is More's incredible study of Cicero. Used to be the most studied person in all of Western civilization by far, beyond everyone else. Cicero's on duties and De Oratore de Legibus and On Friendship. Everyone studied them. People had them memorized. Basically 20th century, now no one knows them, but they were far beyond Plato and Aristotle in influence and regular study and integration into curriculum, memorization, speechification, law, you name it. In the De Oratore, there is a sustained critique of Socrates. That Socrates' apology, the last most famous trial in Western civilization, that Socrates' apology was unjust because he did not attend to his friends. He witnessed to philosophy as a martyr for philosophy, but he enraged everyone there by doing something that was inappropriate to a defense. A defense, the appropriate thing is to try to not get killed unjustly. Instead, he said, you know what my punishment should be? Free meals for all time. That enraged the jury, and they cut his head off. That's More. They poisoned him with hemlock. You're dead. That's not appropriate. We hate you for that. Now, 3 days later, they regretted, and they actually tore limb from limb some of the lead guys who voted to have Socrates killed. More loves Henry. He does not want Henry as his Christian brother and as his sworn servant to Henry. He does not want Henry to murder him. And so he's not going to, right, relieve himself of that duty of friendship. I don't want him to kill me because that would be bad for his soul. Right? Now, go ahead. Well, Fisher is the trick.
So,
Fisher question.
okay, you're anticipating the brick that I want to throw. So, where's Stephen Higgins? He's fallen asleep. Stephen, I don't know if this was a real person or maybe this person who challenged the sanctity of More and upheld Fisher is here. Let me just theoretically throw this brick. I don't understand why Fisher should be canonized, except for his holiness. Like his role in the trial, my understanding is you don't play with civil war. That's Catholic teaching. The conditions weren't fulfilled as far as I know, but Fisher is sending secret messages to the Holy Roman Emperor to invade England and destabilize England. So I've never quite understood how Fisher comes off in the Catholic estimation so lightly for some of the dabbling in what, as a prelate, he probably shouldn't have done. Now, he says in the opening of his work on the penitential psalms that it's the duty of the prelate to correct, which one of More's favorite works, one of More's favorite devotions is the penitential psalms. A layman doesn't have the job to correct. So I think that kind of factors into why More would speak, or would not speak, but Fisher would speak. But Fisher engineers a clause for the oath that you can take the oath as long as it contains to the extent of God's laws. That's what Meg Roper, as far as the law of God, that seemed to go out the window at a certain point on the part of those taking the oath, not on the part of those offering the oath, because More did not ever give any indication to Mag that the oath that she took, which was the one that Fisher wrote, was problematic. So More strikes me as consistent, charitable towards his friends, doesn't want to put the king in a situation where he's exposed without having the proper time to examine the issue, or does something so rash as to execute a just man. But did Fisher?
I don't know if I'm equipped. No, I honestly to suss out, because my memory does not have the strength of what the details of what he wrote to the HRE and like what that was. I think I can speak to the second part of that question, in that in the sense that he is actually in a certain sense, right? He's taken up the cloth and he is out of the political game, right? And in one sense, More and Fisher are getting closer to what we consider to be a more proper separation of church and state, rightly understood, that More's the first non-prelate to be the Lord Chancellor, right? So the unification of the religious or episcopal power with heavy governmental power has been just kind of, well, they're the only ones who can read and write, and they're good, and they know justice, so give it to them. More's the first secular, office holder of Lord Chancellor. So in one sense, they're starting to observe their duties in kind of a way that we might praise or recognize as more fitting to the early church and to certain arrangements in certain times in the medieval. But so in one sense, I don't think he has the same civic burdens, right, of friendship. He's a father, not a friend. And so there's certain amounts of like protect your sheep and also, attack or scare off a lion, right? So he's got other roles to play that are more fitting for him in the sort of grand, sort of dramatic, sense we've been talking today. Whereas More has none of that. And I think he knows his place. He knows what role he is as a layman, as an office holder, as a friend to Henry. But yeah, the peace question, I agree. That's a distinction we were talking beforehand. Aquinas says, yeah, if you think you can get out of a terrible situation, right, with tyrannicide, do it, right? It's technically possible. More says practically in his writings on tyrannicide, it's never a good plan. Why? Because as soon as you do it, there's no trust there's no friendship. There's no civic friendship. So don't do it. Even if you think it's a good call, if you become a menace to the other, then that's it. It's over. There's no England. So I think he knew that if Catholics started to try to sort of Guy Fawkes it, right? Exactly. That's right. And he just understood it as at a very basic level. That is stupid, and because it's stupid, it's wrong, and it's wrong, and because it's wrong, it's stupid. Like, it goes both ways.
Of course, Fisher and More are canonized summer of 1935, and something very important was going on, something much more deadly than the Tudor problem. It was that 2 years before, the Holy See had signed a concordat with the Third Reich, which unraveled within a month. Within a month of that concordat, the Third Reich passed its sterilization laws. And it goes from bad to worse. By the summer of their canonization, most Catholic schools were already being cubbyholed or shut down. It gets worse after that. So let's imagine that you're Pius XI, summer of 1935. You clearly picked these two guys out for that moment. Should they speak out or not? Because historians to this day, their primary criticism is that the Holy See told them to shut up. In fact, forbade the Center Party from raising Cain. What do you think? Can we replay the same story? 1935.
I don't know that you can, but I'm now we're trending outside of anything I've really given much thought to. There seems to be. Well, let me rewind. I don't think you can, in the sense of retroactively applying the situation in Europe in the mid-30s to the situation in the 1530s. There is we're projecting a little bit when we start thinking about this is the beginning of the Church of England, this is the Reformation. That's all how we view it because we know how the story unfolds. But if you look at what Henry thinks he's doing, he's not really cutting loose that much. I think we overplay the first 10 to 20 years of the English Reformation, and we seem to forget a lot of medieval history. There are plenty of rulers who are just saying the Pope can go pound sand. Plenty of them. They always end badly, but there's, in fact, that is. Whereas when you get to, my view is, you get to the 1930s, if the suggestion is we're offering you Fisher and Moore so that everyone can be quiet, it's such a different situation where you have religious pluralism, political pluralism, no unity in Europe. Why would you have the same premium on restraint in the 1930s as you did in the 1530s? I don't see it. I'm interested in what is going on in the mind of Pius XI, if anything, when he canonizes Fisher, Moore, and the other English martyrs. I think sometimes we overplay the the intentionality and planning of central command with peripheral canonizations. Pius XI may simply have been getting good advice on, this would be a good thing in England right now. We need to start, we need more saints. And the ground had already been set by the Leo XIII. I mean, Pius XI is just fulfilling Leo XIII. All right? The canonization process is on autopilot. The real question is, why is Leo XIII elevate the two of them? They're elevated together under the Leo XIII. Leo XIII was, from the point of view of thinking about the relationship between center Catholicism and English Catholics, not afraid to get messy.
Right, but he became best friends with Bismarck and gave him the highest lay award available to the papacy. Culture Compostopic.
Yeah, the center of the church is not troubled by working with authoritarian leaders. Never has. Like you say, the consistent is, let's see if we can't find a way, not let's see if we can foment resistance. I'd say the consistency in the church is to be a little bit like Moore. There must be a way we can work together rather than, like Fisher, let me call in an airstrike. And Fisher is effectively saying, let me call in an airstrike. It is fascinating to compare the exact same moments. When Moore is brought in to give the oath, Moore says nothing. He says, I want to see the king's sealed copy. Oh, that's the act. I want to see the oath. He spends all this time getting them to go over the texts and says, well, the succession, I can sign off on this part of the oath, not a problem. There's just another part that I can't. But if you would let me design my own oath, I'll give an oath that supports Henry, supports the heirs of Anne and Henry. I'll do it. There's just a little part. Contrast that with, we summon Archbishop Fisher and they ask him the question, and all he says is, I will not support the oath. And he's hauled off. There's no finesse. There's no more friendship. He has decided he's going to throw all his weight in with Catherine, with the Spanish, and with those English that he thinks might rise up if there's a military power that is on the horizon, which never seemed to work out too well for Catholics in England.
The Cotswolds. The Cotswolds.
Yeah, let's bring in the Habsburgs. Let's bring in the French.
It just got pounded. into dust immediately. Yeah. So
but I don't know enough about the 20th century. I would love to know more the politics of the canonization and the good intentions and the human intentions behind the canonization.
So I do think I have a disagreement now, which was, we got there. But, it took a while, but we finally got to, is Thomas More a Nazi? So that was good. That's good. The answer, no. So, but I think that the translation of the two is hard, in that, like I said, I don't think More was actually in any effectual way silent. He was governed, and then he had the qui tacit consentire videtur, right? If silence can seem like, or it will stand in as consent under the law as far as you're all concerned, because we have an interior forum, the government can't rule all of us. That's where the church rules Christ rules in the secret parts of our heart. So you can't get at everything. So there's some kind of protection. He pulls that from, this is 1254, Innocent the Fourth, I think, if you know your dates better than I do. That's from canon law. It's not really strong in common law, but he kind of asserts it because it's technically there. He elevates it because he sees what's coming, and he's got to protect people from totalitarianism, right? But everybody kind of knows what he's doing. He has huge polemical works against St. Germain about Caesaropapism, right, and the unification under high pomp and circumstance, legal jargon, right? And he's also watching Carthusians being drawn and quartered and murdered, right? Like the Charterhouse, these guys get slaughtered before More to scare him. And so this I'd say I think we do disagree in one sense. Belloc, I think, didn't have the hindsight of all of our 20th century history that's uncovered, the Eamon Duffy stripping of the altars. I actually think that most people knew that this was a next level horror and were freaked out by it. I think that it was confused by the additional problem of which is mental reservation. The church, in a kind of corruptive sort of rot, was saying you can swear the oath but just have mental reservation, meaning you say in your heart as far as the law allows, right? As far as the law of God allows. Well, they thought because in times past you kind of, yes, okay, you dance for some king who was being tyrannical, and so you're right that there was this sense that these things come and go, and kings do crazy stuff against the church, and then it calms down afterwards. But there were also a lot of people, right as it's unfolding, that this is bigger, this is more substantial, this is foundational, this is revolutionary. And frankly, More's witness, More's polemical writings in those last years to frame it, he humiliated Henry. Henry wanted to go like full Luther. And that was impossible because of Responsio ad Lutherum, which at first he didn't like Luther, but when he saw that Protestantism could get him out from under the Pope, he wanted to do something more radical. But then he destroyed sort of any kind of lower Lutheranism, and then he destroyed the various legal theories. So they had to come up with this like very refined, maladapted version of the first part of the Magna Carta that he's head of the church. So More boxed them in to something like High Church of England, which has ecclesiology, which has hierarchy, which has a church and state and a legal code. It doesn't radicalize. I think More's polemics and patient witness was what alerted a bunch of Catholics, so much so that many of them did go to war. The Cotswolds did. The Pilgrimage of Grace, like it got pretty crazy. And I know you said the first 20 years, and some of that's afterwards, but the Cotswolds was earlier. More forced the issue and raised the specter of all this. And I think he in large part is why Henry couldn't go full totalitarian. He had to restrict himself in a lot of ways because More humiliated him into this respectable corner. And this was the only way he could get away with killing More and getting what he wanted. So I think we underestimate how much and this is not in disagreement with anything anyone said, but this is kind of another further comment, we don't understand how much More's speechification, his polemical work, actually framed England to be the most intact of the reformational disasters, right? That kept a lot of the old good. And I think we are, in a certain sense, the grandchildren of those incredible labors, which is why I often refer to Thomas More as a grand founding father of the United States in some ways.
Yeah, let's take questions from
Hello. Yes, I think I have a lot of questions. I've been thinking about this whole thing. And my main question would be if there is something that, like we talked about how he's the great grandfather of the America, essentially, a great founding father. What does that mean for us? Because if we look at the history of America, has its origins not in the it does have its origins in the English common law, but it also is started with people leaving England because it's too Catholic, even though it's Anglican. The Puritans, and they move on, and even though they're not necessarily the founding fathers, they still have a presence in America to this day. So with that, the revolt of the Puritans to America and founding a part of America, where does that leave us with how we are dealing with a lot of what America is like today, which if we look at it, there are things that's similar to England, but at More's time, but not similar as well.
I'll just thank you, Owen, for that question. I'll just make a few comments. I'll make one major comment. It's the standard narrative that the WASP establishment has wanted us all badly to believe, to say this country was founded by people rejecting Catholicism, royalism, England, and that it was all a bunch of crazy Roundheads and Puritans. It's more complicated than that. Quite a number of the people who came over were high church or recusant Catholics. My part of the world, Maine, is a royalist, high church, Anglican colony until the English Civil War, when the Bay State decides to come crush all the people that are too close to being Catholics. That's a constant tension in American history. The high church, the low church, the Catholic culture, the whatever you want to contrast that with, Calvinistic culture. Who is it? Kevin Phillips, who wrote, there's a great book, big fat book, great. It's a kind of beach reading for graduate students, 900-page book called The Cousins War. And it simply traces the Cousins War, the triumph of Anglo-American culture, or something like that. And it goes through the Reformation, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and the Civil War as a constant unfolding and playing out of this tension, and that it's not just one sort of push towards the inevitable Puritan conclusion, and thank goodness for the Puritans, but it's worked out in a struggle, and we tend to only emphasize half of the narrative and therefore miss out on half of the story and the fullness of the truth.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that, and I would add, I recommend looking at the founding of Maryland in particular, the Charter of Maryland, Lord Baltimore. Those are, recusant Catholics who followed More's lead and served loyally and quietly, even under persecution. They were being taxed, they were being mistreated, they did not have the right to worship, any kind of free exercise of religion, nothing, right? They still were Englishmen, and they worked at court, and they knew who they were. But they didn't lead with it, and they didn't get loud, and that was actually his loyal service is what won him the charter. And so basically one of the 13 colonies was founded that way. And I recommend my colleague Brad Berzer from Hillsdale College, the American Cicero about Charles Carroll of Carrollton, one of the Catholic signer of the Declaration. They went to school at Douay-Rheims, and they knew More's example well. And they developed a kind of, prototype laboratory of democracy, religious liberty in Maryland. Now, the Quakers then invaded from Virginia, started gouging Catholics' eyes out, and then repealed the religious liberty. But frankly, through a lot of incredible Ciceronian rhetoric, the Carrolls won back religious liberty before the Revolutionary War. So, the sort of slipped in contention before the questions began is that even the Church of England, in some sense, is, and this is speculative, and watch me temporize and hem and haw if you called out in public again, but this is already being aired, so it's kind of whatever, in praise of folly level statement, is in a certain sense a Morean invention. He made it so there wasn't another way out for Henry. And there's a lot of good in that kind of architecture that preserves a lot of the kinds of things that lead to healthy civilizations and good constitutions. Add to that More seeding the entire English language. He coined many, many words, many of them to do with liberty and Republican self-government. And he reintroduced a lot of the concepts. And his own trial was a trial of natural laws, that I need silence because the nature of church and state is such that the state is not in full control of my soul, right? So you can't force me and get down into the interior parts of me and my interior forum, right? I need freedom of conscience, right? Because you're about to go full pluralism or civil war and tyranny. I suggest pluralism, so you should respect religious conscience, right? And then he stood up for the church and Christendom and the peace that you get from a unified faith, but also the fact that Henry was abusing the faith. So there's an objective religious claim intermingled, but softened by the other two, right? Like he set up a lot of the kind of expectations for friendship and pluralism that what became the American constitutional arrangement post-Reformation.
Yeah, thank you for a wonderful discussion. My question is, what do you say to someone who says Thomas More was being reckless by not taking the oath that John Fisher put together, or his daughter Meg? Thank you.
The oath that John Fisher took, I'm not sure.
Sorry, maybe I was mistaken, but you said that John Fisher put together an oath, and Meg took that oath. Was that before Thomas More had an opportunity to take that oath?
So there's a couple different oaths, right? The first round that Parliament approved has as far as the law of God allows. Everyone took that one. Because like, well, it allows very little, so we can swear that one. Like, it's a stupid oath, but I'll swear it. And, Henry realized afterwards, like, that's garbage. And it wasn't that it was a trick. It's that Parliament resisted him. Parliament, to England's credit, Parliament fought him tooth and nail the whole way. He stormed in. He scared them. He threatened their families. Like, it was not happy how Parliament eventually passed a nastier version of the oath. Once that passed, Fisher didn't take it. More didn't take it, right? But Meg did, and because so many bishops and so many priests were saying that you can have mental reservation, I think it's More's witness that why at Trent, the Catechism of Trent just annihilates mental reservation. One, everyone's like, wow, we lost a whole country, right, to Christendom due to mental reservation. That was a terrible plan, right? But I think they also just learned that, no, oaths are sacred, right? They're a fundamental bond of trust in a distrustful time. And if Catholics set an example that you can just willy-nilly, say something one way, but in your heart another, Trent just says, nope, that's lying. which is what More's position is. But More only did it in silent deed, not in word. He didn't make the argument. He just witnessed to that argument, and everybody got the message, right? Fisher too on that one.
My understanding is that Meg, on that last oath, said the words. So she agreed to the oath and said, it wasn't in the written oath. She took the oath but added herself to the extent, right? So she added, and I doubt that she's the only person who did this. She supplied words. And so I suppose the question could be, why couldn't More just do that? And I don't think he was allowed to, because if you look at the 1534 letters where More is giving an account of all these conversations between More and the commission, he does start saying, how about you just let me write a part of the oath? And we can't do that. Well, but if you want me to take an oath to support the king and the succession, and I can even find a way of supporting the king's relationship to the church, don't you want me to say an oath that I believe, rather than forcing me to say an oath that I don't believe? And this is your point of, like, More kind of drawing out, if you force me to say the words and only those words, then I can't do it. So he simply, was he reckless? I mean, he was reckless in that he decided in the balance, destruction of my soul or collateral damage because I'm going to stick to silence or just refusal. I'm going to do everything I can not to appear obstinate, but I can't say the oath. So I'll accept the collateral damage. But he tried so hard. At one point he has this wonderful, and again, this is I think the lawyer coming out, where he says, I will tell you exactly. At a certain point, they give up on getting him to sign the oath, and they just say, tell us the reasons that you won't sign off on this. And he says, all right, I will tell you the reasons, but only if first I have a letter from the king saying that I'm allowed to state my reasons and not suffer harm. And they say, but it shows your obstinacy before the court. And he says, if I can have no guarantee that I be not harmed, then it is not obstinacy in the law, right? So More, was he being reckless? I think he just chose to fortify himself as much as possible within the natural law and the laws of England, his powers of rhetoric, and do what he could, but he wasn't going to reveal until the trial his inner convictions or take the oath. So.
I would just add, the recklessness seems to me to be on the other side. Mental reservation, be it oral or the law means what the law says, and everyone knows that's the thing we're talking about. Once you let go of that, bye-bye.
Just a quick comment. I don't know, Susan,
Stephen here. Do we ever find out, are the talks, so IHE organizes wonderful summer trips and programs, and we had this magnificent program in England, and we had Claire Asquith and Gerard Kilroy, and was it Kilroy or it was Asquith who gave the talk on oaths? So I suspect her next book, if you don't know Claire Asquith and you're interested in this time period, then you need to read Claire Asquith, even if you disagree with her. But she gave this great talk about the heightened sensitivity and concern around oaths and how the plays are dramatizing the problem of giving all these oaths when it's, fingers behind the back, or you're trying to get the words to mean what you want it to mean. Yeah.
Okay, can we give Dr. Spahey and Meehan final applause? Thank you.